Our presentation today will be presented by Michelle Thompson. Michelle has worked in quality assurance for over 15 years and joined FDA QRC in 2015. She completed her Bachelor of Science at North Carolina State University. Mrs. Thompson has been a registered quality assurance professional in good clinical practices and is an active member holding elected positions within the Society for Quality Assurance and the North Carolina chapter of Society of Quality Assurance. Michelle is a well-respected business leader and a quality assurance professional with the expertise and capabilities to manage an international team of QA auditing professionals. And she has skills to develop annual audit plans relative to good clinical practices, good laboratory practices, and pharmacovigilance audits. Ladies and gentlemen, I present Michelle Thompson.
Thank you, Janet, and thank you all for joining us today. We're here to talk about due diligence. So let's look at what due diligence is. I love word clouds. I think that they are fun visual ways of looking at different concepts. When you look at this word cloud for due diligence, though, you might see something that's quite important that's missing. And maybe I'm preaching to the choir here, but certainly there is no terminology around quality. We see a lot of focus on business terms and financial terms, and that can often be the way that our organizations feel about due diligence. They simply don't understand the regulatory health authorities are looking for due diligence activities when working with suppliers, particularly including the quality assurance and compliance assessment piece, not just a business piece. Many of you may have a procurement group or finance department. Those groups might have a lot of power over who you utilize or how you go about identifying suppliers, etc., which is fine. But when does quality assurance get looped in? How do you get your vote? Those are the types of things that we're going to talk about today, and hopefully you'll learn some strategies for communicating with the different stakeholders and really educating them on your role in due diligence. Here's the Webster definition of due diligence: required carefulness or reasonable care. Those are all the terms that we're used to when we think of due diligence. The legal group in your company would say there's a standard of care and a duty of care that comes from tort law. So we think about due diligence when one company is acquiring another, or perhaps you're purchasing or acquiring a particular asset of a company. But what we need to start thinking about is due diligence in any contractual agreement, anytime we're purchasing or purchasing a service or product from another organization. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Selection, qualification, what those expectations and requirements are, how to do such assessments, and some helpful hints for contracting. This all, of course, comes under the frame of due diligence, outside of just financial thinking. You will note in this presentation that we use the word supplier predominantly, and that is intentional. I actually did a survey where I sent out some questions to about 8,000 people in the industry and asked them which term they preferred, supplier or vendor. And I was surprised to learn that supplier was strongly preferred, as vendors seem to have a GxP-specific connotation. So when you take this back to your organization, if supplier is not the term you use, feel free to interject the word that is used within your organization. So what is the goal of due diligence? Certainly you want to find the right business partner to purchase a product or service, but let's step back from that big end goal. Really, you're hoping to perform an investigation. The way that you go about doing an investigation is what we call due diligence. You want to be significantly informed. You don't want to have just basic information. You're looking for all kinds of information that can enhance your decision ability. Right? And it's really important that the quality of that information be high. Right? Crowdsourced data only has so much value. So it needs to be collected systematically so that you can compare apples to apples, for example. It should include costs, benefits, and other risks. The health authority point of view. So some of you may be asked within your organization, where do the regulations say that I have to do to do due diligence? Where does it say that I have to assess a supplier before I work with them? So I'm going to give you that information here. This is a reference to the US FDA regulations, but I am making references throughout the presentation to other global health authorities. You might already know that under 312, which is a GxP reference, there is specific information about transfer of obligations. There is similar regulation in GMP and GLP regulations as well. You can transfer those obligations, but they must be in writing. You see here what MHRA, or excuse me, the EMA, takes it much further in their information. And I've provided some letters that were given to organizations for not complying with the expectations. So the first one is from our friends up in Health Canada, where they said the written agreement between the raw material vendor and the drug fabricator were inadequate. So then looking at those contracts, making sure they have sufficient detail to say who is responsible for what the key performance indicators or quality performance indicator will be, what the communication plan is, the escalation pathways, etc. We're going to look at a sample fora later, and that might help you as well. The second bullet could be an entire presentation of itself, but try not to get too caught up in the weeds of it. But this is one that we see quite often across the GxPs with an IT vendor. So everything we seem to do these days has some sort of EAM system in it, right? Maybe it's an EDC, maybe it's a LIMS, some sort of manufacturing tracking process, etc. So here's where the EMA has said, not only did you have a risk-based approach for the evaluation of suppliers, which is good that you had one, but we're actually going to argue that this process was insufficient. So you can read here that there was an EDC provider used by the CRO organization that had used it in the past. The sponsor also had some information about the EDC provider. However, they used a risk-based approach and determined that they could conduct, for example, a one-day remote qualification type audit of this supplier. And in doing so, they produced a report. In this example, the EMA actually wanted to see the report, and after much back and forth, the report was provided. And what the EMA said was the report was woefully inaccurate, or incomplete, excuse me, in that there was no documentation that specific validation was reviewed. And you can see examples of what they expected there. Given this was a one-day remote audit, those documents were not reviewed, and that was part of the CRO's risk-based decision. So unfortunately, they got credit for having a risk-based system, but unfortunately, their criteria that they used to come up to their score, risk-based score, and the outcome and the work that they did to perform the qualification was considered inadequate by the EMA. So it is really important that you evaluate each supplier relationship and that you document that you have done due diligence, regardless of if that's in the past or currently, keeping track of how you've done that, what you've evaluated, and adequate evidence to show that is quite important. So common practices for this qualification, evaluation, or due diligence, depending on what you call it in your company. Most often, you get a list of targeted suppliers. But where does that come from? Who do you need to have around the table to identify suppliers and in the contracting and evaluation process? What measurement system are you going to use? For example, are you going to provide scores where points are allotted or taken away? Is a high score good? Is a low score better? Perhaps you follow the ICH or E9 model where you have color codes. Red, yellow, green. You might be familiar with all these different methods. So if you don't have a documented process, that's really where you need to start. How are financial costs, business needs, and the risks evaluated and weighted appropriately? And your goal of your investigation is to reveal the services that the supplier can provide, information about their quality culture, and the processes that they utilize. You can see here, this is a comprehensive analysis. This is not simply, can they technically do the work, Or do they have the capabilities to do the work? You need to know quite a lot more about your supplier than perhaps you might have thought. Maybe your internal organization says, oh, you have to have at least 3 suppliers. And you don't even know where to start. Or maybe you know one supplier, but you don't know the others. Maybe you spend several hours Googling, looking for other supplier options. Perhaps you ask around the room, does anybody know supplier X? Does anybody know anybody that does this service or sells this product? Often, the outcome of this type of discussion is, yes, I worked with company XYZ at another organization, and they were no good. But they don't have, or they weren't involved in the entire evaluation due diligence process. Another outcome might be, I went to university with somebody at company XYZ. Let's call them. So when we've already looked at the burden of due diligence, we see that that's not very high quality data. Your organization probably writes an RFI. Maybe you also have to write an RFP, and you send that out to multiple suppliers. Quality is often not considered or participatory in the RFI or RFP process. This often leads to significant compliance and quality concerns much later down the line. And as we know in the next bullet, we're talking about timelines here. This can easily take 2 to 4 weeks for each bullet, each step, and most of us usually don't have time for this. Often we are told, we need a supplier yesterday, or we've already started with this supplier. So it's really about how do we get this information quickly and accurately. Maybe you send a checklist. Maybe it's created by QA, maybe it's not. Maybe it's an interdisciplinary checklist. You then have to send that to the suppliers and wait for them to respond. You can spend weeks chasing them for the responses, and when you get them, they may not be as high quality as you expected. You then move to capabilities presentations, bid defenses, where pricing and business becomes the focus. You then have the very last step of making risk-based assessments, and maybe you even do a qualification audit, be it remotely or in person. So this is due diligence. These are steps of due diligence. Just this is like a waterfall methodology where it takes quite a long time and a lot of resources. So if anybody has unlimited time and resources, good for you. That's not typically who I get to work with. So let's talk about some of those risk-based approaches and who's involved. So the stakeholders, here's some friends. The important thing to remember about the stakeholders is that everybody's point of view is important. And I've put some information here about the different representatives and maybe what they bring to the table. We are all products of our experience, and no one vote really or one person's thought is different than another, or excuse me, is more valuable than another. We are going to talk about the golden third a little bit later, so keep that in mind. But looking through this, you can see that everybody is reducing risk or assessing risk just from different perspectives, and they're all valuable. Maybe you work in a small organization where you wear almost all of these hats, and for that, that's easy. The opposite can happen where we have so many stakeholders that we don't have a decision maker. It's really important that your risk-based approach includes a decision maker, and that that role is clearly defined, and the person that is assigned as the ultimate decision maker is willing and able to take that authority and move forward. So how do you make those decisions? We here at FDA QRC have come up with an approach that we call SEED. Search, evaluate, enhance, and decide. Right? The main thing searching, right? Again, you might go Google, you're asking your colleagues, you're asking friends, and then how do you get that information and to evaluate it? Again, is this high quality information or is it more word of mouth information? You then enhance that information by collecting data. So what do you know about these industries? Perhaps you spend time researching health authority inspection results across this type of supplier services or products. How many hours would it take you to find those inspection metrics, go back over years, collate that, perhaps look at your internal systems for other suppliers you've had in the past, look at where their areas of compliance have fallen or quality concerns have been noted, contracting lessons learned. Doing freedom of information requests. Now here in the U.S., we have quite a lot of information that is available to us through the U.S. FDA Freedom of Information request process. You might call it a FOIA, F-O-I-A, and that's what that stands for. Other international global health authorities have less information available through those types of processes, although they each have them. So really, to do your due diligence, you should request that information, and should it not be provided, then at least you have exhausted that option. The average U.S. FDA FOI request takes 4 to 8 weeks for a response, and if it's got any information where they have to collaborate across sections or needs more than one reviewer, it can take over 6 months for an FOI request to be returned. This is according to Citizen Path, which is an online organization that measures such things. There's also a fee associated with these types of freedom of information requests. The minimum fee is $25, but I can tell you we've done several hundred FOI requests in the last several months, and on average we're spending around $625 for a mid to large sized organization's request. That may yield only one inspection or may yield no inspection results. It's the amount of time that they spend digging and researching and producing for you that incurs the fee. So again, if you have unlimited time and resources, good for you. Otherwise, welcome to the world of the rest of us where we're looking for expedited, high-quality information. So here's an example process, and you can see it's quite convoluted. I created this many years ago when I worked in an organization, and I'm a video person. I've switched somewhat now to a swim lane type process that I prefer. But what you can see is that there's a lot of inputs, there's very little outputs, and it's quite circular. The process really never ends, and you go round and round. So it's very important that you have a process and that you understand all the stakeholders. And I just wanted you to see an example. The input. We've talked about the different ways that you can get this information. Starting checklists from scratch can spend hundreds of hours, at least dozens, depending on how many questionnaires that you create and how many that you send. If you don't have an experience with a supplier service or product, how do you even know what to ask? Are you unsure what to ask? How do you know if the response is any good? So I think on average, minimum hours to create a questionnaire is probably 10 hours of your professional time. Maybe you belong to an organization that will sell you a questionnaire or allow you to pull questions from their database and put it together. That's how you're going to meet the 10 hours. You're starting from scratch and it'll take you much longer. Maybe you're lucky enough to get the capabilities presentation and completed questionnaires before it even, like that's all done before it comes to you. That's ideal. There's an entire concept out there of shared audit reports. I can let you know that suppliers really do like this, particularly IT suppliers. They like the idea of having one auditor come in with a predefined scope, asking the same questions that they get asked quite often, providing the standard responses, and sharing that information across potential buyers. There are a few websites out there where you can license these types of audit reports. It can be thousands of dollars, though. Now, mind you, that's cheaper than sending yourself or someone from your quality assurance team out there. But then you always wonder, well, how good was that auditor? What questions did they ask? Right? There's only so much you can gain from that. However, it is more than you had before. Does your RFP actually specify information to help you learn about their quality culture? What kind of questions do you write to assess the quality culture? You go through the proposal process, the bid defense. Is quality assurance included in that? Often not so. Here's your request and your global metrics and indicators. So, do you have all these pieces for your due diligence investigation? If not, you are not meeting the expectations of a regulatory health authority today. So, your process has risks. You know this. You can't accept all risks. You can't mitigate all risks down to nothing. you will have to accept some level of risk. So if you don't have a SOP or written process on how to think about risk, manage risk, identify risk, I would encourage you to do so. There are other webinars available on just how to do risk-based thinking and documentation, so I would encourage you to take some of those if this is a foreign concept to you. But certainly you need to document and capture those risks in a written way. Create a risk profile for the supplier based on their scope of services. How do you manage those identified risks? This is where we come in with risk management plans, escalation plans, and those really great contracts, trying to tie them to some indicators so that you can keep a watch on services or products being procured from a third-party supplier. And what is your risk response? What will you do in the event the risk that you identified is actualized, when it actually happens? Okay? There's also risk that never ends, right? This is not a one-time deal. You have to constantly evaluate. For example, adding or removing services that the supplier is providing. Or perhaps there are now new risks associated based on a project-specific evaluation that you've done. So you need to consider those. Somebody did ask earlier about purchasing other types of reports, SAC 70 reports, and other type of SOC reports. And those are, again, all data that you can use to input into your risk-based assessment. There's no necessarily one that is better than the other. You have to determine how much data do you need. So to do this, to do risk-based assessment, you look at the likelihood of the risk in line with the impact of the risk, and then you subtract essentially what mitigation activities that you can do. You can't see me, but I'd be holding up my arms, one with a parallel line and one with a vertical, and that's how you would score these typically in my mind. Again, there are many strategies on how to score and evaluate risks that I would encourage you to learn more about, but you would ultimately score the supplier with a total number, perhaps that's high, medium, low, and then evaluate each of those risks with a mitigation strategy. Those control measures are then taken and they're documented. Okay? So here's some examples of what those might look like. Is it a single source of service? So is there no other organization in the world or in your geographic area that meets your requirements for this product or service? If so, if not, if there's no one else that can do this, then this supplier is of higher risk already. If there are others out there, but they just haven't gone through your qualification and due diligence assessment, then that makes it a lower risk, for example. If there are a zillion firms available, and you've got 3 or 4 that you've already conducted the due diligence process on, then that evaluation criteria is lower. This is an easy example. Okay. Resource capacity. Do they have high turnover? Have they been added? Are they newly in business, or have they restructured multiple times? What kind of training do they do with their personnel? Have they been inspected before? What was the outcome? Are there new regulations or guidances that impact these types of services or products that you're purchasing? And how does the supplier know about these? What is their culture of quality? That is the single hardest thing to assess in this investigation. So I would encourage you to spend quite a lot of time asking thoughtful questions around this. What do you need to know about their quality culture so that you can feel comfortable that they are staying on top of compliance and what is expected of them, and proactively communicate to you as the contract holder? Third-party management. Do they further outsource work that you've given them? Do they have an internal audit program? And do you? These are all criteria that are going to go into your risk-based assessment. What is their financial situation? Maybe they're a privately owned organization and you have no transparency versus a publicly owned organization where you can get a lot of detail and data. Global organizations vary about how much they will share depending on where they are in different parts of the world. What kind of governance do they have? What kind of business continuity? It's been unfortunate in the last decades that we've had things happen where traumatic things happen in society or within a building, and we have to think about this. If it's a service-based organization, typically the biggest value, the biggest resource they have, and the biggest risk they have are their people. You can't replace the people. You can replace a server, you can replace a computer, you can replace a building, but having to replace the people would take much longer. So including ensuring that they have thought about these things. Obviously, technology is a big issue, what they're going to use, how they support you through their business partner for cloud services, these types of things. We're seeing a big shift in industry around confidentiality, GDPR in Europe, for example, which is really global regulation in my mind. Are they early adopters of new technology? How does that risk fit into your organization's risk profile? So this chart might just help you out if you've not seen one before or have nowhere to start. This is a method that you should utilize. And this is probably one of the last things I'm going to say about risk and how you go about it, because we've talked about all the things you need to know. We've talked about all the ways that we struggle to get the information. So now we've gathered it, we've evaluated it, and what do we do with it, really, right? We've stored it. So the least of these that are used, these are called the 4 T's of risk response. The one that is used the least is to tolerate. We oftentimes at our organizations want to reduce the risk down to a level that is so controlling and requires so much resource and effort and money that it becomes, I can't think of the word, oppressive. We're outside of our life sciences industry, for example, the #1 regulated industry across the globe, if you don't already know, is aircraft. And if you could think about why that is, that makes sense. Hundreds of people projecting themselves through the air, defying gravity, for example. I travel quite a bit, and I've been on a plane where it won't let us take off because the toilet doesn't work, for example. And you think, well, we could fly, it's only an hour, we can make it. But no, they will not tolerate that risk because the controls are so strict in the entire industry. So more like in our industry, we can transfer that risk. Perhaps we buy insurance. Perhaps we write a really great contract where we defer that risk to the supplier and have them report to us on how they're doing and how they're assessing the risk and managing it, right? It is still ultimately the sponsor's responsibility. However, we have documentation in place to show that we have stayed on top of it, which is our due diligence and our obligation under the regulation. What most happens is that we treat the risk, we put things in place to try and mitigate it, for example. So it's important to have a risk response to every risk that you identified through the process we described before. I promised you we'd talk about riskology and the golden third. This is, again, a topic I could spend all day talking about, or at least 30 minutes. And what it is really here, and I'll give you a link at the end where you can learn more about riskology, but I find this very, very helpful when I'm sitting down with the stakeholders and everyone comes to the table with different perceptions of risk. Okay, so that's what this slide shows. Risk-seeking activities or thinking on the far right, and risk-adverse on the left. Now, this is generalized for the population across the world. If you were to subset this out to say just U.S. or perhaps just sub-Saharan Africa, this would shift, but this is a gross generalization. And what this shows is that about 34% of the population falls on slightly more risky than risk-adverse. Okay? So just as an example of what this is trying to show, if we were in a room together, I'd ask you to raise your hand if you think that parachuting out of an airplane is a good idea. and not only is it a good idea, I apologize, but is that considered risky? Would you consider that risky? Many of you would say, absolutely. Jumping out of a perfectly good airplane with only a silk balloon or, piece of fabric to catch you and defy gravity as you come to the earth, that is risky behavior, right? So you would perhaps on that question be on the right-hand side of the screen. Others of you, based on your experiences, might know that there are 2 or 3 parachutes involved, that there's all kinds of gadgets and equipment that can automatically deploy those should you become unresponsive. And all these mitigation strategies that have been used to treat the risk, that they then evaluate the risk and say, you know what, I don't feel that that's a risk-based activity, or at least it's much further to the left than what you at the table are arguing is to the right, that it's a very risky activity. This is an example that I really encourage you to think about when you sit down and talk to people at the table about risk and how to evaluate risk and to score the risk, because everyone will evaluate risk differently. One fun fact that we know from research around human interpretation and evaluation of risk is that CEOs and business owners tend to be far more risky. They are willing to take more risk than, say, your average quality assurance professional. Typically, quality assurance professionals do fall more to the median or left side of the golden third. This is just the way that our brains work and the way that the training that we have taken has trained us to think. Will tend to be conservative. And I hate to make overall generalizations, but that's where we fall generally. So thinking of that, you might have your business and quality assurance sitting around the table at odds with each other. And this is why it's very important that there is a decision maker assigned and that they evaluate and have the ultimate decision on these risk scores and how to move forward in the due diligence process. It is okay to tolerate some amount of risk. And that may be counterintuitive to you, but in truth, it is true. If you'd like to learn more about the golden third, as I mentioned, there's a slide at the end. It's very interesting. It's been done by a gentleman called William Burstow, and it comes from Popular Mechanics magazine, this particular slide, and tells us that lucky people take advantage of chance encounters and opportunities more than others. So there are people that are more prepared to take risks, and they tend to be your CEOs and such. For you and your organization, you might have one product in the pipeline, and if it doesn't make it, the organization goes under. Some people might interpret that as we need to be risk adverse because this is our one shot. Others might say, if you don't play big, you don't win big. If you don't take a risk, you're not going to get there. So these are different ways of interpreting the same concern. All right, so we looked at due diligence quite in depth, the definition, what kind of data you need in order to conduct this investigation. This is what the definition of qualification is: a thorough knowledge about the vendor quality system and qualification activities, which is done through an in-depth audit or assessment. That sounds a whole lot like due diligence. So if you use these terms differently or interchangeably in your organization, it's okay. You can substitute out the word vendor, you can substitute out the word sponsor, because again, depending on where you are in the life sciences, that may or may not fit with you. So I promised you we would talk about a TORO, or maybe you guys called it a TOSO, transfer of sponsor obligations, or transfer of regulatory observations documents. I used to see these quite often in the GxP environment 10, 20 years ago. And what the picture is on the right is simply a copy and paste out of a document where we would say, well, here's the regulation and who's responsible. And we would put both, or in some cases, one company or the other. And the health authorities are coming back and saying, yeah, you can't do that anymore. Simply putting the word both is insufficient. So instead, you need to do a due diligence assessment that you have assessed the supplier's staff to ensure that they are qualified, that they have spent sufficient time on the activities, and that you are overseeing them in a cooperative manner. Your assessment has to be sufficiently deep to include a suitable number of examples. So again, having in your output, perhaps it's an audit report, perhaps you have some sort of other output, you call it something else, but you need to say, well, I looked at X record and determined based on my evaluation of X record that this is adequate or inadequate, or this is the risk and this is how I'm going to mitigate it or accept it. And these are the triggers I'm going to watch in order to evaluate on an ongoing basis that risk. That output should ultimately say, is the vendor qualified or not? Is it satisfactory? And if there are shortcomings, what are you going to do about them? That's really essential. We saw that from the EMA letter. A quick note on inspection, since we always have questions about inspection. The sponsor or the CRO, whoever is performing the activities, again, depending on where you fall in the life cycle of the life sciences development process, is ultimately responsible. However, the questions during an inspection can be asked by the person who performs those activities. You shouldn't try and speak to activities that you didn't conduct yourself. It's important that all the stakeholders and all the different suppliers that have gone forward to produce the work and the data that has been submitted to any health authority are available during an inspection period and have collaborated. Okay. So I've told you about the business case and why we have to do due diligence and why it's so important and all the struggles and how to get the data and what to do with the data once you have it. So the good thing is that here we have created the Orange Report, and I would like to introduce you to that today. This is a tool that will be launching, I was hoping this month, but perhaps it will be early next month, where we have gathered a lot of this information for you. It's a new online tool, and it can be found at theorangereport.com. This is a community where we bring together buyers and suppliers to solve the due diligence question. How can we rapidly and accurately facilitate this process and expand everyone's ability to move quickly within the industry? So really, we're saving time and money for all stakeholders, both suppliers and buyers. The goals here are to save the time and money and speed up the process and the timelines involved. But within the Orange Report, you can go online and you can see the different suppliers that sell a product or service within your area. There's about 31 different service areas from GMP, GxP, GLP, where we have collected their information. You can compare and contrast organizations. If they've provided a pre-audit questionnaire that's been completed, you'll be able to purchase that as well as the capabilities presentation. And they've been committed to responding through a direct link within the website to any queries within 24 hours. Additionally, we've done all the Freedom of Information requests, searches, and analysis for you and written that up in an Orange Report that you can purchase. So, this is what we try to do. Now, our due diligence data that we're providing to you in the Orange Report will not replace your process, like that big process map we saw. However, it should give you a lot of data and a lot of information quickly to help you expedite your process. So perhaps all of this information goes in, you're able to cut down your qualification audit from 2 or 3 days on site to 1. Or perhaps you evaluate it and come up with that it can be a remote audit. Perhaps you don't do an audit at all before contract execution, but you do an in-process audit shortly after when some data has been collected. These are all possible outcomes. On the supplier side, they really like participating in the Orange Report because they do these activities that are repetitive often, so they can facilitate and save time and money on their side by doing them once. For many suppliers, they've partnered with the Orange Report, and we've conducted an independent audit of the supplier where you can get that full audit report, you can get the agenda showing the full scope, the responses, etc. So you might be asking, what is the cost? You as a subscriber or a buyer can look at our website for free and see a limited amount of information available. If you'd like to get detailed information about each supplier, purchase and access on a monthly basis for $49, or of course, if you want to save even more time and money, you can sign up for an annual membership where you have unlimited access for the whole year for $499. So that's 2 months free. The supporter supplier that I mentioned does pay for the audit, and there is a cost associated with that. Otherwise, they provide their information to the Orange Report at no cost to them. Here's the different types of Orange Reports that I mentioned. You can have the basic report, which is purchased individually and separately from your monthly searching abilities. This has information about the supplier, their culture, their regulatory history, if they've had inspections, for example, and then we've included quality indicators that we have from the industry. So the Orange Report is affiliated with FDA QRC, which you all know us, and that's why you joined us today. And we've used audit inspection data over the years that we've collected from doing independent audits, in addition to the metrics that are available from global health authorities, to collate data to say, for example, what are the top 5 issues with this type of supplier in this part of the world. So these are areas that you can know, in general, have concerns. So in your due diligence, you can specifically address that with the supplier and or internally when you're evaluating the contracts and strategies that you're putting in place. The enhanced report has that same information, but now there's additionally information on their quality management system and their personnel and training. You also get the completed capabilities presentation and a qualification questionnaire. I will say our qualification questionnaire is created by qualified quality assurance professionals. So we are auditors that are selecting the questions and sending them relevant to the scope of services or products that are sold by the supplier, saving you time and money. The last option is the Orange Report with an audit supplement. And as I mentioned, you get all of this information, plus the audit report, the responses, and the certificate. The supplier will update this information annually, and you will be given that information as well if you have purchased the audit report or the audit supplement. So here's how we look at that speed we talked about before: search, evaluate, enhance, and decide. We hope that the Orange Report will help you to do each step: searching in our database, evaluating the information using your processes, enhancing that information and evaluation by purchasing an Orange Report, and ultimately making that decision. There are a few advertising opportunities. I just want to put that out. If your organization is interested, you can go to the website and see where that might be. Also, if you are part of an international agency that perhaps doesn't sell products or services to the life sciences, but is interested in having access to this population, for example, you work for a not-for-profit that provides training and things like this, you can log in and create an account and just be an advertiser without your company being listed in the Orange Report. That is perfectly fine. And instructions, and there's a video on how to do that if you're interested. So just wrapping up here, because I do see we're getting short on time. Here's some references. As I mentioned, they all come from different health authorities worldwide, as well as some information on the Golden Third. And the last slide here is going to be the instructions for how to request a certificate. If you have not chatted in your question yet, please take the time now to do so. You can follow this link. I will be following up with an email in the next couple of weeks that has the link to the certificate again, as well as a link to the video. You can see other videos from webinars that we've done on our YouTube channel, if you're cool like that. But we do ask that you give us some time to process the video, etc. So thank you all for your time today, and have a great day.